All right, so we're here today for a very interesting conversation around Linux desktop. I'll give a little bit of my background for people who are unfamiliar with me. My name is Noah Gift, and I'm an adjunct professor at Duke, also at UC Davis, done some books in the past, and I also am the founder of Pragmatic AI Labs. So it means that I produce a lot of content for, Coursera, edX, on topics like AWS, GCP, Linux, Rust. And so that's what has really led me to the Linux desktop question. And I have an expert. And Michael, do you want to introduce yourself and talk about your background?
Sure. And I won't go back to the birthing process or anything like that. I'll just try to stay focused on what's relevant to today's topic, which is um, I've been trained as a product designer, and that's been my career. I started off with automotive design. I've owned a tier one automotive design company. I've worked in design for a very prominent software company that supplied aerospace and automotive. And then I came out to California, worked in the advertising industry, and then as a UX architect in Silicon Valley for a decade. Um, I've also published a few works, including a book on single page web applications. And 5 years ago, just about 5 years ago now, decided that we needed an alternative in the high tech ML workspace, if you will, um, to MacBooks. Did not feel that they were a good fit, actually, for what they were being used for. They didn't have NVIDIA hardware. They were not particularly performant. They were very pretty, but there was also a lot of work that's unseen behind the curtains of startups where they spend an extreme amount of money um, converting between Macs to their deployment environments, which are almost always Linux. There's a saying, nobody deploys to Mac. So we started this business with that target market in mind. And we've made some pretty significant inroads in certain industries where people really need something that works and that they can develop and deploy ML pipelines on their desktop.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a perfect background to start. The why are we even having a conversation? So the topic that is, I think, a very interesting topic for many people is this topic of Linux desktop, and
Mhm.
a lot of people have been saying this, not me. A lot of people have been talking about how 2024 is the year of the Linux desktop, and I think it's an interesting, question to say, okay, well, why 2024, and then is Linux desktop actually a legitimate solution? I mean, maybe technical people who have been in the industry for a while or maybe scoff at it and go, Linux. So you're just one of those, zealots who just
Mhm.
is too hardcore into open source. Like, why would you want to use Linux desktop? And so I think that's potentially maybe like the framing is that some famous people have been talking about this. I think one of the famous people is the creator of Ruby on Rails,
Mhm.
DHH, talked about Year of the Linux Desktop, and
Right.
and and I think part of the reason that people are very curious about this is that the only two options really are Windows operating system and OS 10, but there's been kind of a fringe
Mhm.
Linux, offering here, and I think maybe that's the place to start. Is so, you know, why would someone want to use Linux as their desktop in 2024?
Well, it's kind of funny, my mother told me never to talk about religion in polite conversation, but here we are already. And I think actually religion is a very important aspect of this discussion. Um, so everybody who's gone to university has seen fraternities and how fraternities work. And there's always the nerdy guy in the fraternity who does everybody's homework and writes their essays and the like. And he oftentimes, at least in traditional stories, is the kind of guy that is tolerated, yeah, but in a way, people actually kind of talk with him about in derision, and they kind of make fun of him. Go watch Animal House again. I'm certain that archetype is there. Um, and that's been the Linux developer in Silicon Valley for a long time. You go to Google and they give you a Linux laptop if you want one, and you were mandated to have a Linux desktop, and that's for a very good reason. But the developers who don't have to worry about deployment as much, or they kind of get a pass using almost exclusively Macs. And I'll talk about the reason why they use Macs, because there's some good reasons actually. But there it has been, and I was one of them, that insisted on running Linux for development. And I and all my nerdy friends who were in the same sort of camp almost always ended up spending a lot of our time kind of off the books doing other people's homework. We were writing scripts to convert stuff that they were doing on Mac to make it deployable to the Linux infrastructure. And Mac is deceivingly similar to Linux in a lot of ways, but a lot of people don't know, like, for example, that the file system by default is all caps only. And not that I've had to deal with that, but that's just like one of those weird little things that you find out with HFS. And maybe I'm misspeaking about that, but the bottom line is they run a different set of tools. And you can do a lot of work to make it more Mac-like, but not a lot of developers do all that work. And so it ends up that you really have kind of two pipelines. You have a Mac pipeline of development, and then you have to bring it over the hump and bring it over into the Linux deployment area. And sometimes bringing it over the hump is a lot more expensive than you think it is. So, but you do have people that are, pretty religious. So bringing it back to religion, like I promised in the start there, that are pretty religious about doing this stuff, and they run where they would run Linux because of religious reasons, like they believe that they need to have this freedom, and they have these tenets, and that they need to stick to when developing software. But a lot of folks in Silicon Valley that did run Linux were very pragmatic and practical, and I'd like to think that I was one of those, and continue to be one of those. And the pragmatic reasons are the ones that I've mentioned. The fact that you can write once and deploy, that you can think and test in your deployment environment before you ever get there. That actually saves an enormous amount of time in a lot of situations, especially as we're using a microservices architecture, and typically almost all your containers run Ubuntu LTS anyway, or something very similar. You can basically develop on your own Kubuntu Kubernetes container system on your desktop, your laptop, and then just push it to the cloud through an automation script, and it generally just works. So I think that that's one aspect and the reason why we were founded. And I was using other systems at the time, but I didn't feel like the emphasis on the key aspects that Macs provide was being addressed. It was like everything that you could get tended to be very much aimed towards people who wanted bleeding edge software, bleeding edge kernels and stuff like that doesn't actually sync up with deployment environments, and doesn't focus on the key benefits that Macs provided. And so I know I've been talking for a little while, so I'll pause for a moment, but I am ready to tell you what those key benefits are and how one can attack them.
Yeah, so I think that's a good setup that fits with a lot of the stuff I've done in my career too. So I'll tell a little bit about my background and how it relates to Linux.
Hmm.
So when I started in Caltech in 2000, this is 25 years ago, everybody used Linux because it was kind of the cool kids used Linux, they used Python,
Hmm.
and the really cool kids had actually Solaris systems. It was like, oh, Solaris. It was like, oh, you're a Unix person and Unix programmer, and so that was kind of how I got introduced to Linux. And then later, when I worked in the film industry, like you said, everybody that works at when I was at Disney Future Animation, I mean, they were contributing to the Linux kernel at the time. I mean,
Hmm.
everybody had Linux, desktops. They had NFS mount points for home directories, and you could even make the argument that, let's say, early 2000s in the film industry, that setup is superior to majority of people's setups 20 years later. First of all, like,
Hmm.
almost nobody that's a modern developer knows what like NFS home directories are
Hmm.
like and why they're so useful and like
Hmm.
and like all of these really cool things we had in the film industry. Same later, I worked at Sony ImageWorks, who made like Spider-Man, all those. Same thing, everybody Linux, everything desktop. And there's all these automation things that you can do when you have network home directories, and everybody can share configuration files, and it's simplicity. And as you mentioned, the reason they give everybody a desktop is that it mimics production. I mean, that's the in some ways film is weird because they
Hmm.
have a lot of problems, but some of the things that they do right are that they don't give you an option and say, oh, well, we're going to have lots of different flavors of operating systems. They're like, look, we make a film on Linux, you're getting Linux, period. In
Hmm.
other places, maybe there's been some problems in other film studios, but the ones I've same with Weta Digital in New Zealand, super famous company, Lord of the Rings, all those movies, Linux desktop, that's what you get, here we go.
Yep.
No, the software industry, when I worked at startups, yes, you see the whole thing. I've worked at Windows shops before where everybody's Windows. I've worked at places where they have Mac laptops. And as you described, that problem of my Mac, it works in my Mac, but it doesn't work in production. As someone who's been CTO before, it's like, it's so annoying because it's like, look, I don't care if it works on your Mac. We're not
Hmm.
developing Mac software. We're developing stuff that needs to be deployed to a server environment somewhere. And so
Hmm.
that problem has gotten a little bit easier because the open source ecosystem like Homebrew, those kinds of things have kind of made it a little bit better. But the reason why people the I would say one of the reasons why some people would say, Mac is what they would prefer is that, and I would definitely put myself in that category up until recently, is that, they feel like they're going to be more productive because it's a seamless experience.
Hmm. Yes. And so it is until you're looking to deploy oftentimes. And so where I left off, and by the way, thank you for backing this up. And our office is running NFS, by the way, with shared configurations. In fact, it's built into our product, like that we've abstracted like our command line notebook utility to use $home instead of a hard coded path so that everybody can share the same configuration. So it is a wonderful thing that as a guy who worked on Silicon Graphics back when they ruled the movie industry on IRIX, and my former roommate from college ended up being a sysadmin that you probably know from the film industry. So some pretty wild stuff there. Um, but why is Mac a seamless experience, and why do people in Silicon Valley like to use Macs? And I kind of studied this a bit, and it's a combination of religion again, then also beauty, um, and um, also some very strong attributes, um, along with hometown bias. So if I can just start from the top with beauty, um, Macs are beautiful machines. And in fact, that's been their primary focus for a long time, to the extreme until Johnny Ives left. Things were getting thinner and thinner all the time, and it was getting rather silly where the keyboards weren't working and you couldn't find any ports and stuff. It was getting to the fact that it was like a supermodel on heroin. I mean, it looked great on the runway, but really couldn't do much with it because it was just too thin. Um, it has turned around from a design standpoint, and now the machines are beautiful from the standpoint of display, quality of materials, and everything. They are fantastic looking devices, and they're status symbols. And a lot of engineers want a status symbol, because once you've got your MacBook Pro that costs $4,500 on your desk, well, you've made it. And that's not to be underestimated. I got a lot of people that we deal with that say, "I love your machine. I love what you can do for me." I told you this story yesterday where we had a guy who was in a church. He was like a pastor, and he's like, "How can you get me green bubbles? I want it. I really want your machine. I want the freedom it provides me and everything, but I need to be able to show green bubbles to my friends when I'm messaging from my computer. Otherwise, I can't move forward." And I'm like, seriously? So, talk about religion, right? But so the beauty and the craftsmanship in the product itself is very strong. There is home time bias, which is Silicon Valley likes to use their own, and I understand that. That's good. The other thing is that uh, a lot of companies, even modest sized companies, are ditching their IT departments. They're like, okay, everybody gets a MacBook, and your IT department is the Mac store or the Apple store. And so if you got a problem with your machine, you bring it into the Apple store and you pay $600 or $800 or whatever to get it fixed. And the last gig I was in, I swear, uh, maybe it's me misremembering, but there was a lot of time spent by individuals just saying, "I'll be at the Mac store today. I'll be at the Apple store today." And I think that oftentimes they were getting their system just completely wiped and reloaded. Um, and it was just accepted. These people that were making these AI incomes, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, $300,000 a year or more, they just, one day call in and say, unannounced, "I have to be at the Apple store all day." And everybody just kind of went, okay. And then they showed up the next day again. Um, so that is basically outsourcing their IT to Macs or to Apple, and the intention is to be a low IT environment, and so Macs slot in really well in that respect as well. Um, and generally outside of that, they're pretty reliable. So anybody who's going to look to replace those sorts of systems have to figure out how can you provide a low IT system with Linux. And instead of focusing on the cutting edge, bleeding edge, hobbyist, I always have to have the newest thing, no matter how buggy it is. You need to look at providing a reliable alternative to that ecosystem. And so that's what we've spent the last 5 years working on, is building an ecosystem that fills all of those missing components, but then also provides the innate benefits of Linux on the desktop. And then if we want to go back to religion again, I think that the reason why 2024 is coming around to be what some people are saying the finally of the year, the desktop Linux, is because now we've got a situation where the two major OSs available for the desktop have jumped the shark and have gone full on spyware, 1984 telescreen invasiveness, to a point where people just can't stand it. And now that you can't buy Windows 10 on a new machine anymore, I don't know if that's official or if that's just a pragmatic reality. But now that you can't, you're now an official spyland zone, and people are losing their minds about it. Everybody wants to use AI, and it's a wonderful tool, but they want to use it on their terms, and they don't want to just suddenly have say a word and then be offered an advertisement or a suggestion on how to use that word better without being prompted. It's jumping the
Yeah,
gun.
I think that's a great segue to, like, to talk a second about what happened with the Linux server.
Mhm,
So as I mentioned, like, I remember at Caltech. I mean, Caltech is in many ways as good as it gets for like Unix, like maybe MIT, NASA. Like, I mean, there's a very few places where there's going to be like that much talent with Unix and Linux. And boy, Caltech, I mean, they had like 50,000 users on their cluster. I mean, just
mhm,
crazy stuff. But what was interesting is that later in my career, I worked for a company that was doing cloud computing, like not a major vendor, but like pre-cloud
mhm,
cloud company. And one of the systems that I worked with was a Solaris. I think it was like a T2000. I think was the box where they had some of the first virtualization that was hardware software, combined,
mhm,
where they had LDOMs and all kinds of like fancy like stuff. And I was like, what? I mean, way more sophisticated than Docker, like way, way, way better than Docker.
mhm,
And in many ways, it's like a Ferrari. Like Solaris was like, and same with like IRIX, those kind of
mhm.
systems. Like these are Ferraris. Like these are like, oh my God,
Yep.
these are amazing systems. But now let's take a second and think about the fact of like, where is Solaris and where is IRIX? They don't
Mhm,
exist. And
mhm,
I think that's where I kind of see what's happening. And we'll get back to the spyware thing in a second. What's interesting is that this idea that there's a premium product that you want to pay Ferrari prices for. The premise is a reasonable premise, like, and I think that the market can support it for a little bit, but it can support it for a little bit until the bottom gets good enough, or like the baseline gets good enough where you go, you know what? Actually, I like a Ferrari, but you know what? This, I don't know, $30,000 Tesla is actually
mhm.
pretty good. And in fact,
Right.
I'm okay with a $30,000 Tesla because it's as fast as a Ferrari, but it's $30,000. And I think that's really what happened with the server market, is that even though there are some boxes you can check where
Mhm.
IRIX, I mean, I worked with IRIX quite a bit in Turner Studios for a bit. We had like incredible IRIX systems, like
Oh, yeah.
for real time compositing. I mean, just insane systems. And
Right.
same with Solaris. Like, but in theory, well, in not just in theory, but in practice, some of the things are better. Like check, 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 right?
Mhm.
But they cannot sustain that against a commodity product. And I think that's what happened with Windows Server as well. Windows Server, nobody in their right mind would deploy Windows Server. I mean, Windows Server is makes zero sense unless you are deep inside of the the headquarters of Microsoft, sitting next to the CEO. You're not a fan of Windows Server, in my opinion. Like,
Mhm.
I mean, there's very few. And so what happened was Linux is good enough, and not only is it good enough, but in the places that it's weak, it's developed alternate strengths that are potentially superior to it. And so I think now the market share is, I don't know what the market share is, 95% or 99%, something so crazy for server. And I think what people thought about with desktop is like, yeah, 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 yeah. But like, it's some of the same reasons that people were talking about IRIX or Solaris at the time, is like, yeah, but they have this and this and this. And it's true that the desktop has this and this and this, but we're now at the point now where the Linux desktop in 2024 is good enough. And in fact, many parts of it are superior. And then what's the cost?
Mhm.
Zero. Right, right. The cost
Well,
is, I mean, at least in terms of the OS itself, the cost is
right.
zero. So, then you get to the part of like, well, wait a second, actually, there is something happening here
Hmm.
before we get to the spyware section. Is there is something happening where the argument that, Mac is superior for this, or Windows is desktop is superior for this, just like right as Solaris started to die, like 2007, something like that, I think, that right as they started to die, that's what's happening for people that know what's going on, is that the desktop operating system is good enough. And I think that's the thing that, of people like me who are tech people, I think a lot of them aren't yet aware of that. That
Hmm.
that and I'm not into exaggerating. I like to be very factual about stuff. It is good enough. I think that's the thing that most tech people don't know, is that it is good enough, and in many parts of it are better.
Right. So I think that the what you're looking at is, ironically, is that Linux has taken from two business models that have proven to be very successful. Um, One of them is freemium, which is, obviously you get a working system for free that does a lot. And in fact, it's amazing how entitled some people feel they are to, something that has a kernel alone that's worth billions of dollars in development time, and that has all this work around it, that has, you know, tens of thousands to millions of hours of development poured into it. It's become kind of like the lingua franca of computing. If you're going to build a new version of ZFS, which is an encrypted snapshotting file system, you might build it for Solaris, but you also build it for Linux. And if you like the XFS file system, which is great for lots of small files in the audiovisual realm that you're familiar with, well, guess what? That XFS has moved over to Linux as well. So all the cool stuff from IRIX and stuff have kind of migrated to kind of a central trunk of code that benefits the public. And I really think that there's a lot of um, wisdom to for any company, but also for any country that decides that they want to support a central operating system approach. There's a lot of benefits from that, because it's become kind of the super highway of the United States, and of the world from a computing standpoint. You want to do something with your supercomputer network. Well, you don't hop on the Microsoft bus to get there, or the Mac bus to get there. You hop on the Linux bus, because all of this communal work has been poured into this trunk of knowledge. And if you need something to be expanded, well, then you expand it and improve upon it. And oftentimes you add it back to the trunk so the next person can benefit from it as well. So it's not really a commercial product as much as it's an infrastructure product. And I think that's pretty amazing. And if you don't believe that, all you got to do is go to a place like China or someplace where um, Microsoft licenses in the United States at the time are running $400 a pop. And Microsoft looked at what was going on in China, and they said, people are pirating Windows left and right. So they started selling Windows for $5 a pop. Isn't it great? You go to China and you get 1/80th the cost for your Windows license. Well, why is that? Why is it so inexpensive
That
there?
might be the true, because the true value is zero.
Well, the value is enormous. I would argue, but the thing is that your competitor is zero. And Bill Gates is on record for saying, I'd rather have them pirate Windows than use Linux. I'd rather have him pay zero, because that's what he's up against. He's up against a freemium model. Now, Linux is not free, and it is free from the standpoint of you. It's free for you to pick up and use. It's not free from the standpoint that nobody that works on it gets paid, right? You've got Intel engineers that are making very, very good income, and engineers around the world that are working on supercomputers and make fantastic incomes. And but they're contributing back to this um, trunk that benefits all of humanity. So in that sense, it's not the labor on it is not free. And but yeah, entry for the end user is free, and it's been a very effective strategy, especially on servers. But it's also been quite popular for your set-top box, for your cable box, for the
Embedded
Internet of
devices.
Things, all Linux, right? All supercomputers run Linux. And even in the gaming space, Steam Deck runs Linux. Um, Gaming on Linux now is better than it is on Mac by a long shot because of compatibility later called Proton that was developed for Steam Deck. And Valve helps pay for the desktop system, which we use, which is KDE. We help pay for it too, though. And those benefits, benefit everybody that uses it. So it's just kind of a different income channel and a different way of looking at the product that funds it.
Yeah,
And
well,
it's
and I think like before we get to this, or maybe as a transition to the spyware topic,
yep.
that it might be worth discussing for a second, just the American capitalistic system. In I'll preface this by saying I am a small business owner.
Hmm.
Your company is a small business, so we're whatever we say is we're entrepreneurs. So like
Right, right.
we believe in the free market, etc. But
Hmm.
the thing that I'm going to say is that if you look at the food system, which is something I do feel like I have some pretty good expertise on because I have a bachelor's degree in nutritional science, and I also teach data science at
Hmm.
multiple universities, including Duke. So I know how to look at data and make decisions based on it. That there's a lot of evidence that the American food system has been heavily poisoned. I mean,
Hmm.
that's one of the ways to categorize ultra processed food. There's a lot of research that's coming out that links, for example, xylitol is 1,000 times increase in stroke, which is a artificial sweetener. Like a
Yeah.
lot of the gums, like gar gum, and that are in Tabasco, or not Tabasco, the hot sauces,
Hmm.
they're or any kind of a sauce. There's
Ice
links
cream.
to like it interferes with your microbiome. So basically, palm oil is another one.
Sure.
It's a cheaper oil that they strip the rainforest. They take the vitamins out. That's also linked to obesity, diabetes. And if you look at it, what's interesting about it is it has some parallels to the computer industry, is in that why are people doing this? Well, because publicly traded companies, the only way that they can continue to grow is they have to either get new users, sell new products, or reduce costs. And so reducing costs is pretty simple. You take something that's the necessary ingredient in food and you just substitute it for something that's food like, right? So for example, in the case of xylitol, well, it's like sugar but it's not sugar. Or palm oil, it's like oil but it's not really oil because I took the color out and the vitamins out, and I
Mhm.
it's called palm oil. And that's really what ultra processed is. And I think there's a lot of awareness now that these are heavily linked to the problem of longevity in the United States, where from a data science perspective, we're at the same level as a communist country, which is our neighbor, Cuba, right? If
Mhm.
you really think about that, there's an island that has sanctions on it, and
Mhm.
they're living longer than the typical American. There's something going on with the food supply. And so now if you take that kind of that type of thinking and then you apply it to the software industry, well what's happening is that because of the structure of American capitalism, there's lots of different business models in different parts of the world that have some pros and cons, but the American style is this quarterly earnings report, and constantly reducing costs or making new products or getting things addictive. That's where I think we look at things like the OS 10, or we look at Windows, and it's like, oh, the same stuff that everyone's aware of that happened with the food industry, they're doing the same thing with the tech industry. And it's not enough to just sell, let's say, a Linux desktop machine and say, hey, here's a nice profit margin on this Linux desktop machine. Thank you.
Mhm.
That's not enough. You have to
Mhm.
reduce the cost of the components, maybe outsourcing it to countries that have questionable labor practices. You also have to sell them things they don't need, maybe get them an iPhone, get them a smartphone. That's not enough. We need to keep making money. Let's get you addicted to maybe some apps on there. Oh, that's not enough money yet. Let's go ahead and get you a subscription. And before you know it, you got a Happy Meal, right? And it's like you're all full circle, that the CEOs, I would call them the Ronnie D's, right? They're Ronald
Mhm.
McDonald CEOs, and they're really trying to sell you a Happy Meal that you get addicted to, and they're selling you things that are not really a computer. It's computer like, right? It's like, well, it's kind
Mhm.
of Linux.
It's a portal
Like,
to your wallet.
yeah, it's a portal to your what? Like because
Right.
again, if you look at what's inside of even like a breakfast sandwich at McDonald's, like you could make the argument like, well, maybe you could make a breakfast sandwich that's not unhealthy. It's true, but I think I looked at the ingredients maybe a year ago, and a lot of those ingredients are like, is what is this? Like what is what's in this thing? And that, I think that's part of the problem with, you look at OS 10, and that's maybe a segue to the spyware, is like, well, wait, why is some agent running on my machine sending packets to these companies? What's happening here? Like, why is OpenAI gonna get all the stuff that happens on my machine? Like, I didn't want cardboard in my sandwich. Like,
Right.
like
I didn't pay for cardboard in my sandwich.
yeah, like so I think that might be like a good segue to kind of talk about the market conditions are there
But
really
I've got some
yeah,
things just to
yeah,
add that I think you
sure.
you find interesting. One thing that I think is kind of interesting to mention is that in Silicon Valley, especially, there's another way to earn money, and it's called investors, wild-eyed investors. Wild-eyed investors that want to see things happen really fast and make it feel like they're going to get super rich instead of just plain rich. So that brings about a rather odd ecosystem here. And that's actually the reason why agile technologies has become so popular in Silicon Valley, because it makes people feel like they're moving faster than they actually are, right? Like if you actually sit down and design your product efficiently using a cross-functional team, and it was we've had a conversation before where I explained to you, like, these people are like, well, this is moving slow, but the reality is that actually you get your results faster if you do them smartly and you design like people design in automotive industry when they need to get things done. There are methodologies for doing that, but agile has become popular because people who are investors and that are googly eyed and want to go in for 3 or 4 rounds of billions of dollars, or at least hundreds of millions of dollars. Um, they want to see and get the impression of rapid development. And so Agile works just fine in that, because there's a lot of people that are very busy right off the bat, even though usually all their early work is thrown away because they always end up building the wrong product the first couple of times. Another thing that you're seeing here is MMR. Now, you did not escape the valley before MMR became a hit, I'm certain. And that was around 2012 or so. MMR meaning monthly, well, now I have to, monthly
M-
recurring revenue.
MRR, yeah.
Yeah, MMR. So, and people are just banging that drum. And, you wonder why you hit the start button on Windows and you see an ad for Tam Tams. It's because of MRR, sorry, monthly recurring revenue. Um, so there's been a push also to outsource development as much as you possibly can. My favorite little story is one of the guys that worked on the stability system for Boeing 737s was in Bangalore, and he got paid $8 an hour. I believe that system was called MCAS or something similar to that, right? So that's what happens when you've got when you're managing by analogs. You're managing only by the numbers. So the other thing that you're seeing a lot, and I think you're getting, and this is the reason why you're seeing pushback for people saying that's it, I'm moving to Linux, is that okay? I'm done being in a rental economy where I have to rent everything, and I've got 25 subscriptions. I used to have basic cable for $50 a month. Now I have to pay for 5 streaming services that cost me 75. What have I really gained here, right? In the same respect, you're seeing uh, people that uh, you're running Google for Workplace, right? Um, you're using it for just basic stuff. Now they're coming back and saying, "Oh, we're going to raise it by 25% because we have to pay for all these new AI features you never asked for." Right? And then that's the plan for the AI integration that you're seeing on these desktops. You didn't ask for it. It's free right now. Once they, eradicate all the competition, and then eventually it's going to become an upcharge. And I think that that's what people are seeing. They're figuring this out. Um, and the other thing that we talked about a little bit before is banditware, which is, are these things that were being presented really legal, right? Like, can you go and scrape all this copyrighted material and then just regurgitate it through a different algorithm and say that that's perfectly fine? Like, can you go and scrape GitHub for all the content that's on GitHub as the basis for your AI and then use it to power an AI? Well, you know, it's being tested right now, but the whole point of ChatGPT and these AI systems is to get it out there and get it ingrained in society before legislation has a chance to ban it. Because once it's ingrained, nobody's going to ban it. And if you don't believe in that business model, look at Uber, because that's what they did. Look at Airbnb. Look at Willow. All these companies that have come up, and we talked about this, there's been papers written about it, that their whole strategy, even YouTube, their whole strategy was to break the law, and break it so completely that they could have the laws rewritten to fit their new business model. And I think that we're in a seminal moment here with AI. I think AI is wonderful technology. My company provides complete systems to companies that develop ML pipelines. So I'm not a Luddite, but I do think that as how it pertains to the desktop, that it is fitting in with all of these trends that I've mentioned, um, in terms of monthly recurring revenue, and in terms of banditware, and in terms of an AI upcharge. All those apply to what's coming, and I think people have gotten smart enough to see it. So I think that's the reason why you're seeing people going, "That's it, I'm
Yeah,
done, I'm
yeah,
out."
yeah. And I mean, I'll mention myself. So, as someone who's used, I've used Mac for 40 years. So, I think when I was maybe 7 or 6, I don't remember the exact age, we got our first Mac, and then I just always use Mac, and yeah, Mac is good, and they do cool stuff. But what really got me to permanently shift away from Mac just recently and buy a Linux laptop from your company, KFocus,
Mhm.
is that I don't want to be the product. And I think that was the thing that was kind of the final straw with Apple, is that there's lots of Apple people that said that was what made Apple different, was, hey, you're not the product. Like, everyone knows at Meta you're the product, right? Like,
Mhm.
basically you're the person that's making them money just by doing things on their platform. But with Apple, they're like, hey, I'm smarter than that. I'm paying money and I'm not the product. But once you develop a partnership with OpenAI to send data to them, no, then you are the product, right? That's
Yep.
and that was kind of that was kind of the final straw. But what was interesting is that for me, as I've kind of unhooked to it, what I realized was, and this is an aha moment, and maybe other people will have this aha moment as well. And I'm hearing from people that maybe they are, is that what's weird is that you don't even need it. Like that the entire ecosystem you don't need. Like it reminds me of some of the CTOs that I worked with when I was younger, and they were like 50 and I was 20, and it was like they would tell me these stories of, yeah, this one time we had 1 million lines of SQL and I deleted it with a bash script, and you were like,
Hmm.
come on. And they were saying the truth. Like they took something that was like unknowable complexity and they deleted it. And in my career, I've done it many times with different code bases in many languages. I've done the same thing. Like the same problem kind of exists is you get these like bespoke weird things and they're complex and nobody knows what's happening. And then what you start doing is you start unplugging the cables, metaphorically, and then you're
Hmm.
like, wait, it doesn't do anything. There's nothing happening in this code. I deleted all of the code and it does nothing. And it's like
Hmm.
it feels so good when you do that. Like you're like, whoa. And what I
Yeah.
realized with Mac is like when you pull back the curtain and you see the Wizard of Oz back there, is like, don't pay any attention to the man behind the curtain. It's like there's nothing that Apple makes that you need. And I think that's the thing that very elite people in society don't yet know is that you don't need a Mac laptop. You don't need iCloud. You don't need an Apple TV. You don't need AirPods. You don't need any iOS apps. And I know people are white knuckling. Oh, no, but I'll never make money again. And like, no, like literally, there's not a product that Apple makes that you need. Similarly, you can make the argument about McDonald's, and more people would accept it. It's like there's not one product that McDonald's makes that you need. There might be
Hmm.
some people that would argue, no, no, I like their French fries, but
Hmm.
most people will go, you're right. Like I don't need a McFlurry. I don't need like anything that McDonald's makes. And I think that's the kind of like the shocker is when you unplug from Mac, you're like, wait, you mean like Word, like docs, like just a word processor, a spreadsheet, like you mean there's not one product that you need from Apple. There's not one product you need from Microsoft. And these are $1 trillion companies. Trillion, $2 trillion right there. Not one thing they make you need. That doesn't mean that you may want to, for choice or whatever, pick one of these products. But once you realize that, it kind of sends like shock waves throughout the ecosystem for a second. You're like, what was I doing? And how did I get sucked in? And I think it's the same way that people have gotten sick from the food system in the United States. And certain periods of my life, I've had
Hmm.
maybe weighed too much or whatever. And I think it's easy to get caught up into it. Is that you're told that you need to have breakfast and you need to, eat some kind of fast food or you need to eat some packaged thing. And then once you realize that actually there's nothing that an American corporation sells you that's food that you also need as well, right?
Hmm.
You can grow a tomato in your backyard. You can have some chickens and have some eggs. You can pick up some commodity rice and beans and some olive oil, then you're probably good, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think that's the really the I think the aha Linux desktop moment to me is that Linux desktop is a gateway drug to like a deeper awakening, which is that no, I'm not some weird hippie, even though my parents were hippies. When, and so I'm like a normal person who's like super productive, runs my own business.
Hmm.
I have lots of things that I'm doing. I use every advanced technology that exists, and there's not one product Microsoft or Apple makes that I need.
I think your parallelism with McDonald's is actually extremely apt. Um, you don't need to eat McDonald's, but gosh, it's convenient. And that's the intention with Microsoft and um, Apple. Their intentions, and they make some great products. Visual Code Studio and the like are good. And there's a lot of people who develop for Linux using those products, but they run them oftentimes on top of Linux because they want to opt in, not opt out. And Microsoft realizes that, and a lot of their money now comes from Azure Cloud, which is hosting a lot of Linux containers. Nobody tells, well, it may be out there what the number is these days in Azure, but last I knew, even 4 or 5 years ago, the majority of their cloud was running Linux. How much majority, I never picked up, but I'm certain that has not changed. I'm certain that's only increased. Um, but yeah, people want to opt in and not opt out. And so you really have two opposing forces. And again, you spent time in Silicon Valley, so you know of the other drumbeat that people in executives here have, which is lock in, lock in, lock in, lock in. So I was VP of a pro am um, system where for pro am photographers. And I remember working with the product group on that one. And the CEO was like, we have to lock people into our platform as soon as possible. I'm like, well, thanks, Gunjadin. That's a real great idea, but it's a real bad idea. And the reason why is because people are wise to this. And if you start doing these overt lock ins, what's going to happen is people will never step into the door to try your product. I'm like, we need to come out right off the bat with this is the button you press to export all your data.
Well,
And
I mean, I think you're right. Like, as someone who still teaches in business school and has read a lot of these business school books, that some of them are interesting. Like, there's a book called Seven Powers from a
mhm,
Stanford, professor that talks about strategy and all these books on like addictive feedback loops. And I mean, the
mhm,
the theory is interesting. Like, and a lot of them, like, yeah, this is good stuff. What's sad though is once you start to use a product like Apple and you're like, oh my, how many MBAs at Apple are just now in charge of the entire product lifecycle? And you can see that basically what they're doing is just hooking you deeper and deeper and deeper into Apple so that you'll never get out, like Apple Pay, right? Or
mhm.
AirPods, or like, and you start to realize, like, you don't care about me. You don't care about the product. I'm just the person in the drive-through ordering another McFlurry, at 10 p.m. to you.
It's a financial company. It's not what they're doing is they're using their capital to acquire assets to provide passive income. It's like a YouTube scam at a $2 trillion scale. Um, that's you saw it with Sony acquiring Sony Entertainment. You're seeing it with Apple now with Apple TV and buying shows. If they're ultimately a financial company, and that's what's driving them, and that's fine. And all companies at their core are ultimately financial, but it's is it is it something that is being done because of a passion for the product or a passion for your customers, or is it being done for the passion of the accountants?
I
And
I think I think the answer is obvious that
right.
it's not the product, and because the if Apple was making things that were useful only to the customer, there would be less things and they would be better. And there
Yes.
and then you could even make the argument that a lot of Apple is inferior to Linux. For example, like you said, if a lot of developers are using it because it's convenient to develop software, what if they made it not, gutted from a Unix Linux perspective, so that you have to install Homebrew and you have to install all these other tools just to get it to work? There's all these reasons why I think it because of the pressures of the American economy, and the stock market, I think it has jumped the shark. And I think the OpenAI one is a perfect example of that. Is like, what customer wants their data to go to OpenAI passively? Like, I'm sure 20% of customers probably would like it, right? Like, hey, yeah, awesome. Yeah, take it. Yeah, my mail, my iCloud healthcare data. Yes, take it. Yes, come
Yeah.
on, give me more stuff. There's always people like that. But if you really did a survey and explained actually who runs OpenAI, the what that person's track record was when they were running Y Combinator, like, and kind of give them all the facts. I find it unlikely that there would be customers that would say, mm, like,
Right.
let's not let's do something different. So I think that's where, when you look at, even going into the grocery store, shifting for a second, if you go even to a premium grocery store, you go to Whole Foods, you can grab, let's say, organic tortilla chips. And it's like, oh, it's organic, it's good, and it's at Whole Foods, awesome. You flip around, it's like palm oil. And you're
Hmm.
like, well, and then if you hadn't read about what palm oil is and everything, it's like they I think it's in Malaysia, they'll gut an entire strip of land, just burn it, clear strip it, plant palm trees on it. So they're destroying, basically, rainforests to make palm oil. Then when they take the palm oil,
Hmm.
they run it through a chemical solvent that gets rid of the color of the palm oil, because it's a yellowish color, to make it
Hmm.
clear. And then they also got to get rid of the vitamins, because that adds a little bit of flavor to it. So they're kind
Smell.
of making like a motor oil, essentially,
Yeah.
like a industrial oil, and that's in the premium stores, right? So I think that's, unfortunately, as an American consumer, because we have very little regulation that protects the consumer, even in the best situation, you have to actually, like, go into like a premium store that you probably pay too much money, and flip over every single ingredient and go, oh, what is in here? Oh, yeah, that could hurt me. I don't want to buy this. And I think the same with computer now, is that there are some things where they're unambiguously good. Like, I think the Linux desktop or the Linux server is unambiguously good. Like, if you install it, one of the reasons why it's superior is if you run, like, I'm running the system monitor right now, and I can see all the different things. I
Hmm.
don't see like packets, like, oh, tracker, bossware. Ooh,
Yeah.
like, like there's some kind of like tracking system automatically installed. And I think
Well,
that's part of the issue.
I think that the thing that you're actually seeing there, that I was kind of building towards when talking about uh, this, and your palm oil discussion just adds more to it, uh, which is that uh, the reason what you're being sold is the matrix. When you're dealing with the big tech, you're given the convenience, the frictionless ability to take a picture and just have it automatically updated to your iCloud, and people get hooked on that, right? It's just so convenient. And it's convenience the same way that palm oil is convenient to put into the burger buns at McDonald's. It's the same thing that's driving that, and the same thing that's driving the companies to want to offer that to consumer, because that's part of their lock-in. The interesting thing about, and the infuriating thing about developing within a Linux ecosystem, is that you can't do that. In other words, let me rephrase that. You can do that, but you need to expose to people, number one, everything that you've done to make the product, so that somebody else can make it better. And it is infuriating, honestly, in some respects, to work a lot on something, and then have that oversight. But it keeps you honest, and it keeps the products from being destructive to the consumer. And the oversight is not only in the code itself, but it's even in the structures that develop the code. One of the things that the laptop on your desk that I think you're using right now, right? That system is running an official Ubuntu flavor. And that means that there are multiple tiers of oversight that make sure that the components that go into that system are open and beneficial to you, the end consumer. And it makes sure that when a new kernel comes out, there's an entire team that works in the kernel to make sure everything works well. And then we take that kernel and then we test it on all of our hardware, including your hardware, before you see it, right? And that is all part of the open source ecosystem where you can do the same sort of stuff that's being done there, but there's two things different. Number one, there's oversight from the community and the structures that have been formed around it. Um, and uh, Number two, it's free for you to use. And if you compare, and it goes back to the trunk, it goes back to the publicly available knowledge base that is the Linux source code. A great example on this is AirDrop, right? Apple for years prevented people from moving things easily from their phone to their computer. But so they created this lock-in-ware called AirDrop that is comical in how convoluted it is. And on the surface, it's really simple and any idiot could use it, which is what they're going for, I think. But in terms of real capability, it's pretty pathetic in a lot of ways, right? Now, if you go and you want the source code, well, good luck. You're not going to touch it. It's done the way that Apple wants it done. You go to your desktop, you open up an app called KDE Connect, and you can move the mouse cursor with your phone. You can move files anywhere you want to. You can share images back and forth. And that's all open to the public domain. And most people will say that it is in most ways vastly superior to AirDrop, not only from a functional standpoint, but because it's also available for anybody who has an issue with it to go and add the features they want or improve the existing features. So, and the thing that the companies that are pushing the lock-in have to deal with is there are openness standards that still apply to proprietary companies, and so that's something that they have to deal with if and consumer backlash. So if Apple gets a little bit too walled gardeny, the U.S. government's going to step in, or consumers are going to step in, and they're going to deal with the backlash on that. So that's the reason why you see some interoperability, because these guys do not want to kill the golden goose, but they also want to keep putting up walls and keep introducing artificially in a lot of cases friction to make it more difficult for you on an iPhone, for example, or me on an iPhone, to send a message to somebody on a Windows phone or an Android phone, because we just want to make it annoying, because you're the product, um, and not what you're holding in your hand.
Yeah, I think we're now maybe it would be a good time to go to like the next step, which is we I think clearly talked about why people are interested in moving to Linux, and I think now we've also talked about that it is functionally in many ways better. And I can say as someone who knows technology
Mhm.
deeply, that and uses every possible bell and whistle, like the I'm using like a 4K camera DSLR that hooks up to like USB,
Mhm.
and then I have a super fancy mic, and like I do video editing, and like I code in Rust, and I do Docker, and there's not one thing that didn't work.
Mhm.
I just today downloaded some financial data, and I was looking at it in Excel, doing some like the equivalent, which is LibreOffice. I was doing some like calculations. Like there's not one thing that a professional would do on a Linux machine that that they would do on a Windows or Mac that they couldn't do on a Linux desktop. And I think that's the one where I know lots of people who I told them, "Hey, I'm done with this. Like, I've had it." And I think the two things that I hear from very, very accomplished, smart people with PhDs or double masters or like just super smart people, is that well, you do need a smartphone. Well, first of all, that's incorrect. You don't need a
Mhm.
smartphone. The second is that you need to have uh, Mac or Windows because of XYZ. And I think that might be a good, thing to maybe start to finalize our session today is that I think there's a misconception that you're like a barefooted hippie in San Francisco who's like, kind of going to the local dispensary and like have all these creative ideas. And yeah, that's why you're using Linux. And in fact, that's completely false. Is that not only is it good enough, but in many ways it's superior to Windows and Linux. And I'm not selling anybody anything. Like I personally am not selling people something. What I do for a living part time is teach students, right? So
Mhm.
I'm a professor because there's other things that I've had offers to do things for much, much more money from big,
Mhm.
big companies. And I've said no because I like what I do. Similarly, the reason I'm telling people about Linux desktop is not I'm trying to like scam someone or get them into Bitcoin or something. I'm truthfully saying you're delusional if you think that you cannot use Linux desktop as a substitute for OS 10 and Windows. So as the person who knows 1,000 times more than me about it, potentially you could answer that question.
Absolutely. I think what you have to decide, if you decide you're going to run a Linux desktop, is are you going to be your own IT department? Because that's what you end up having to um, do in if you're not careful. Um, so remember when I talked about low IT systems? The reason why Macs work for low IT is because Apple produces only a certain number of different systems. And then they maintain their OS for those systems, and their upgrades generally work quite well for those systems because they test them before they push them out. Um, People who run Windows systems tend to have a lot more volatility on updates. There's stories everywhere about people saying I was about ready to give my presentation, then Windows decided to upgrade and broke everything. And then I had to go on stage with a notepad and a pen. But even in organizations that run Windows, you typically have the Geek Squad that is your IT department, and they do things like test all of the hardware that they keep in their roster and make sure it works before the Windows updates gets pushed to your system because you're a business. You can't have everybody in the company have a automatic upgrade to the system unnotified and breaking things while they're in the middle of the presentation, or breaking things 5 minutes before they have to go on to a presentation or even a day before. They need to keep those people working and on a reliable systems. So the challenge that I always had working in Silicon Valley and even in the Los Angeles area when I was working in advertising, and we ran giant Linux clusters. So not too different from your rendering clusters in some ways, anyway. Um, the challenge always running the Linux desktop is there was all this benefit of being in that incredible trunk of knowledge that is Linux and being able to develop in Linux and then just push a button and deploy and know you could even do performance testing and get a good feel for that locally before you deploy to the cluster of hundreds of machines. So that is a huge benefit, and having the freedom to control your hardware is a huge benefit. The downside is that people think that they're going to go out there and buy this Asus laptop that has like this awesome screen and these awesome speakers and this real tech interface for their Wi-Fi. They're going to get whatever hardware they want, and then they're going to take Linux, whatever Linux they want. I like this rolling release that gives me all this great, wonderful new features here. This bleeding edge features that are, that way there's going to be no bugs because these developers are going to keep adding these features and fixing the old ones. And they're called rolling releases. And if you think back to your days about how things were run in your video editing experience, you know that that didn't happen. People didn't bring in their own Asus from home and load up whatever distro they wanted on those devices because your production house would lose way too much money
Well, they
real.
went out of the ones that did that went out of business, actually.
Yeah, yeah. And it's you're basically there is a real cost associated with ensuring you have reliable, repeatable systems. The system on your desktop right now has configurations that when you take that disk and if you put it into a different model, it'll automatically recognize all the different hardware and reconfigure kernel parameters. It'll reconfigure scripts. It'll reconfigure DPI settings, all that sort of stuff, so that if you drop it in, it'll just work. And that's expensive. It's also we've been working for 2 weeks on a new kernel that's going to come out for that system. It's tested on all of our systems. It's tested for microphones. It's tested for cameras. It's tested for wake and resume. It's what an IT department does. We're basically a virtual IT department for the hardware that we sell. So,
I mean, if I had to kind of go back to the food analogy, the way I would think about this is that, let's say right now, majority of people, which has happened in the past. I think my grandfather, who fought in World War II in Korea, I remember when I was a kid, he would go to McDonald's every day.
yep.
And because it was like what you did, it's like, oh, went to McDonald's every day for. So right now, what people are doing is they're having the equivalent of, a breakfast sandwich in the morning. They're having a Happy Meal at lunch, and then maybe like a Big Mac for dinner, and then maybe even a McFlurry somewhere in there. And that's the equivalent of what Windows and OS 10 are, is just all day long feasting at McDonald's, getting supersized. And then
Mhm.
hopefully what we've said is like, well, actually, that's not good for you, right? So you need to eat fruit and vegetables and whole grains and eat the Mediterranean diet. We know that people live to 100 years old.
Mhm.
So then people are convinced. And but then the thing you're bringing up, which I think is, which is then the next step, is like, well, yes, I could have a bunch of chickens in my backyard, and there may even be some benefit to having a little bit of chickens in your backyard, and maybe grow some basil and some rosemary and some tomatoes. But you can't build a farmer's market in your backyard, right? You got to go
Mhm.
to the farmer's market, right? Because the people that are the experts at organic farming, they know stuff you don't know, and that's what they do for a living, because they're pros. And I think that's where I kind of see your company, is that you're what I would call like, people have decided that they don't want to die early from McDonald's anymore,
Mhm.
and now they want to eat organic food, but they also are realistic, and they realize that like they need to partner with people so
Well,
that they
they
can
live.
get them off. That's right.
Yeah, you live in an apartment, or in this case, if you want a low IT system at work, you really, if you're going to deploy at work, you really need to either get an IT department that does what we do, or you get systems like that we develop that have the low IT built in, because like for example, let's say you have an issue with you attach three screens, right? And you don't know this, but on your system, if you attach three screens, when you log in, everything looks perfect. That wasn't the case when we got involved. We actually had to write scripts to make that work. And then after you log in, everything looks perfect. We also did that. And then when your system comes up and you decide to rotate your screen 90 degrees, you don't know that there's actually 58 different wallpapers that have been configured so that the wallpaper works right when you rotate your screen. You don't know that until you, and even if you do it, you don't know it. But What we know as a company is you're not calling us up saying, I broke my system because I rotated my screen, or I broke my system because I added a screen to it and now the login setup looks wrong. It's like it's kind of just silently there, right? And by the way, there are companies out there. I don't want to make this a pitch for my company. I'd love to, but let's be fair and let's be honest about what's out there. There are some companies out there that do this. They just have a different approach or emphasis than we do. Our emphasis is really going after your former employer, which is like a Hollywood production house. That's a level of reliability and focus on stability that we have. You want to go with another company that has a rolling release and gets you new software faster. If you're in that kind of hobbyist zone, there's companies out there that provide that. There are companies that I can't speak to their testing practices, but ours are all public on our website. And we even have a pledge about how many years we support our hardware, which is a minimum of 3 years after the last sale. So typically you're seeing 4 to 5 years of continuous IT support. And we have people that have bought systems back in 2020 that have gone through 2 and will soon be 3 major OS upgrades on the same hardware, and it just keeps working. So the point is that you don't know if you decide that you're going to go out and just buy any hardware you want and think you're going to pick up just, oh, this distro has good wallpaper and you're going to be successful, you're going to repeat the same story that you're going to see over and over again on Reddit and on bulletin boards everywhere. People that have done just that and then found that they had to be their own IT department and found that they had incompatible hardware or whatever that they had to get fixed. And they weren't able to do it. And they're like, this is too much time and effort. And then they say, okay, Linux is the problem. It's no, Linux is not the problem. You're paying with these other OSs, people, in some cases, thousands of dollars for the integration of hardware and software. And you decided to try Linux and you decided to pick up and buy from a Windows vendor that puts nothing back into Linux, and because you thought the hardware was pretty, and you picked up this system that you didn't investigate compatibility with it, and you dropped it on there, and it didn't work, and you got a very involved and frustrating hobby from doing that. You can do that, and some people like tinkering like that. And if it's your hobby, that's great. But all I'm saying is, if you want to have success and have plug and play like what you're doing, probably the reason that microphone works is because we've tested the kernel and made sure that it works. And if the kernel doesn't work for a plug-in microphone, we stop it from showing up on your machine, right? So,
Yeah. I think it would be. I think the most, you know, intellectually valid argument that someone could have is like, well, yeah, but I don't have the time, and I can't do this, and it's too complex, and it's true. It'd be like, if, to use your examples here, like if someone said, hey, I watched the Blue Zone documentary on Netflix, and I'm convinced I need to have more, vegetables in my diet. And I went to Home Depot and I got some tomatoes. I put them on my porch, and then the next day the squirrels ate them. I hate tomatoes. I'm going right back to McDonald's. Well,
mhm,
there's nothing to do with tomatoes.
right.
Right? Like, it's that the ecosystem you're in basically could not grow a tomato. That does not mean a tomato is harmful to you or inconvenient, etc. That you need to figure out how to buy into the ecosystem that will support a healthy lifestyle. And so I think that's really what you're saying to me, is that for people who want to take the step to go to Linux, which I think they should, and I also it
Mhm,
would say that, and this is just my opinion, is that people should also rethink even having smartphones in their family or having smartphones. But the first step would be, you need to get into an ecosystem where you have experts who help you out, because
right.
that's what a community is.
Right. We
Like,
have companies, they run
yeah,
all our systems.
yeah,
That's their policy, is that for at least segments of their business, They just buy our systems because they don't want to. They don't
It
want
just
to
works.
do.
It just
They
works.
want to press update, and the updated, validated changes come in, and their system keeps working the next day, right? And do we make mistakes? Sure, we make mistakes. Like any IT department's going to make some mistakes, but they're very few and far between. We have policies and procedures that are stringently followed for everything that we do, and we have logs and everything that's tested. So, yeah, there's going to be an esoteric hardware configuration that'll break on a kernel update, but all the mainstream we've tested and logged on all the platforms. I don't want to get into us so much, but my point is that um, you can let us do that, or another company do that, or an IT or a managed service provider company do that if you're going to switch over to your business. But don't, as a business, say, okay, guys, now it's a free for all. You guys go out there and buy whatever Asus or Lenovo or whatever system you want that's designed for Windows, and we're going to drop whatever version of Linux you want on it, and we're going to have utopia, because that's not going to happen. You got the same real constraints that you had back in 1998 when you were doing video production on the Titanic on Linux. I guarantee you every single node in their cluster was identical, and every single node had the same loadout of Linux, and they were all optimized to work together. That's what you want. Okay, you want that as an individual, preferably, because not everybody can be an organic farmer, right? Not everybody has the land to do it, but you can still eat organic without owning the land. And I think that's the right parallel here.
Yeah. Well, I think hopefully we were able to uh, inform people, because I think that's what I try to do is not sell people things, but inform them. And that, to me, it's, I think, clear that some percentage of people, hopefully, that see this will think about the fact that there are alternatives to what they're currently doing, and that hopefully we even convince some of them that it's superior. And I
Mhm.
mean, I'll use, maybe close with one thing, is that, and again, this is somewhat unrelated, although it's a little bit related to Linux, is that when I got off of Mac, I also kind of got off of smartphones, and I bought like a really crappy Android that, like,
Mhm.
and it don't even really use it, and like all it can do is do a call, and I have to get a text on it, and does this, and then I have like some single purpose devices, like I have like a really cheap Android tablet that just does like banking. So they're like bifurcated. And what I found is that, I mean, I would say I feel relaxed, I sleep well, like I have no need for anything that happens on a smartphone. I've even gotten rid of data plans, so I'm saving money. And there's not that many things that are like that in life, where you discover something, you're like, wow, my life is a lot better now. And
Mhm.
I, for me at least, the smartphone is like, eh, just don't need it. Don't need it at all. Nothing. There's nothing on there I need, and I'm saving a lot of money. It's kind of the same way as if you were eating a bunch of fast food every day, and then you realize that some people informed you that, first of all, you don't even need to eat breakfast. You probably don't even need to eat lunch, right? And you absolutely don't need to eat fast food. And then you're like, oh wow. First of all, I have a lot more time now. I'm not eating fast food all the time, and I'm also saving money because I'm not buying fast food, and I feel great. I think it's the same thing here with Linux desktop, is that hopefully that's maybe the takeaway, is that some people go like, wow,
Mhm.
there's something that's that big of an impact on my life that I could do, this week. I could order a laptop maybe from your company,
Mhm.
and it's like my entire life changes for the better. And I'm going to tell you, correct.
Yeah. Yeah. And if I can just close out from my standpoint, which is kind of dovetail into what you're talking about, is that um, when you decide to go into Linux, you just need to decide how you're going in. In other words, if you're going in as a hobbyist, There are actually systems out there that you can buy that are labeled DIY systems, and just to spell it out, that's do it yourself. They're telling you you're going to do it yourself, and if that's what you want, then that's great. Just be aware you are going to do it yourself, and you will be your own admin, and you'll be doing your own testing. And if a new kernel comes out before you present, it's up to you to test it. Okay. Um, and because regressions do happen. Uh, but you can also pick a more full-fledged ecosystem if you just want to get to work, and if you just want to, if you will, eat organic without growing the vegetables yourself. But so just think about that before you dive in, and before you select hardware, and before you select a distribution, And if I give a little bit of practical advice on that, speaking of distributions, there are distributions that are designed for stability and usability. They don't move as fast, but they definitely are more stable and reliable, like Ubuntu LTS, Kubuntu LTS. These are official Ubuntu flavors that have a lot of oversight and a lot of testing on them. Red Hat, of course, is another one that fits that category, and SUSE. You start moving away from those that are derivatives but not officially supported by the infrastructure. The amount of testing and the amount of reliability you're going to see is going to go down. They may look prettier, they may be neater in a lot of different ways, but you don't have the same infrastructure behind you. So for whoever's making the jump out there, please give that some thought before you do it. Again, nothing wrong with being a hobbyist, nothing wrong with learning everything from the ground up if you're into that sort of thing. That's what I did. But think where you want to be on the ecosystem and give back to the ecosystem. You don't have to give it to us. Go to somebody else that provides full service Linux systems if that's what you want to do. But give back to the system and help invest in it, because that's the way things will get better for everybody.
Wow, thanks. I think we nailed it. I think we were able to cover everything that I thought would be useful to people, and I really appreciate the time you gave to our conversation.
Well, I really appreciate being here, Noah, and thank you very much. I can talk about this for hours, as you probably have figured out.
All right,
And thanks.
talk to you later.
All right, cheers.